those inquiries too, whether somebody's looking to do research for a property, or if they want to do genealogical research or look at some of the court cases, we handle a lot of those inquiries. Specifically, I work for a research department that deals with the legacy of slavery in Maryland, and what we've done is we've gone through a lot of those government records in our stacks and tried to look at the population that was being enslaved. And it's an interesting process because, as we'll show here, and throughout the discussion, a lot of these records are not about the slave, they're about the slave owner. So there's that interesting twist on when you're trying to find information about an African-American family, how you need to know that other component. And what we've done is we've gone through and specifically tried to go county by county, and we just call it county studies, where we'll go into each county and first we'll look at some of the federal census that were compiled and extract that free Black or mulatto or enslaved population to get the sheer numbers and look at where these people lived. And then what we'll do is we'll try to go into some of the periodicals, newspapers, and kind of see if some of these individuals show up utilizing a lot of the runaway advertisements that were published during the 18th and 19th century, and I'll bring some of those to light here. But it's a very interesting project, and we do go beyond enslavement, where we also start to look at their continued involvement in the formation of Maryland past slavery. So especially now we're doing a lot focusing on the civil rights movement as anniversaries are approaching. So we have the benefit of using a lot of the holdings at the archives to look at this specific population, and it's a great project, and have to be a part of it. So a little bit more about what exactly the State Archives is. We serve as the central depository for all government records that were deemed to be of permanent value to the state. Our holdings go all the way back from the founding and settling of the colony in 1634, all the way up until present day. And these include executive, legislative, and judicial records from the state level down to the county and municipality levels. Some of the different types of records that we have are probate and vital records. These are information about estates, and also about some of the vital statistics, birth records, death records, marriage records, and such. We also have a large capacity for land records. That's probably one of our more utilized resources across the board for our patrons. What we've done is we've had a project that maybe about 10 years ago, we were published online what's called MD Land Rec, and these are every piece of paper involved in the transaction of property in land that would become Maryland is all digitized and available online. It's a free service. You just have to email the archives, we give you a password, and you're able to go and access all those records. And then the federal census records and also court records. We also do include some business records and all the various state publications from the agencies throughout the state. We do have a small, what we call special collections, and these are collections that we deem to be important to the state but are outside of the realm of the government records that we have. So these include some private papers of prominent families, large map collection, some photographs, big newspaper collection, and that's a resource that our department has utilized quite often. And then, of course, church records. Here's the building here. It was built in 1984. It's located on Route Boulevard, directly across the street from the Court of Special Appeals and the Navy Marine Corps Stadium. And all of our records are kept in a controlled environment to prevent further deterioration from the paper. This is a large, most of what our collection is. So let's look at the tobacco economy here in the Chesapeake. The climate and the soil here in the Chesapeake are actually perfect for growing tobacco. Tobacco was already popular in Europe by the time of Maryland's founding, but the trade at that point was monopolized by Spain, and that's why I have it up here, where John Ralph in 1612 smuggles a more desirable strain of tobacco. The native tribes here in the Chesapeake region did have a tobacco strain, but it wasn't really palatable to markets over in Europe. So in 1612, he introduces this strand of tobacco. It's called Oronoco, and he takes it into Virginia. This strand was derived from his voyages in the Caribbean, and it was a much stronger flavor than the sweet-scented tobacco. There are two strands that came from Chesapeake. You have sweet-scented tobacco found on a lot of the rivers down in Virginia, which is a more, as the name implies, it's a milder smoke. And this was more popular in England. However, Maryland was growing a different strand, and that's where the Aronica name comes in. And this was a stronger flavor, but it was more popular on the continent in Europe. So merchants here were able to find a market for both strands, no matter where they were. At first, tobacco was used as a medicine. You see some prescriptions for it for toothaches, asthma, cancer, get rid of plague or worms. We even have some instances where it's used to help control labor pains. I can't imagine how that happened, but it was, and all these uses were in place before it actually became just a recreational vice. 4 years after Maryland is settled in 1638, we find an act here in the General Assembly where tobacco actually becomes an acceptable currency. So here we have the original document, and if anybody wants to go ahead and try to read that, have fun. But basically, where the red arrow, and probably we have the transcription next to you. We have here a simple line that just says, ordering the payment of tobacco passed. And basically what this is implying is that fees or duties or fines or any kind of exchange, tobacco would be able to be used as a legal tender. Now, I think this is important because as we look at some of the other acts that were passed at the same time, it's quite telling. So here you have the assurances for titles of land, for liberties of people, swearing allegiance to the sovereignty. They are building the foundation for the colony of Maryland here. And it's interesting to note that tobacco is an integral part of that foundation. So that's why this is unique and also quite important to the future of Maryland, because so you have to do an exchange in order for goods and services, but there weren't a lot of coins in circulation from England. They weren't finding precious metals here in the colony. They weren't minting here. And actually England, from the time of settling in the Chesapeake, they actually imposed a policy where they would take coins out of circulation just to control their colonies and the settlers that much more. So they had to find something in order to continue on with life. And that's where tobacco comes into play. This is unique because you don't see this anywhere else in the world. You know, sugar was not used as an exchange in Brazil or Jamaica. You don't find this in exchange for wheat for the colonies up in the mid-Atlantic states. So just another unique facet to Maryland and its founding. And Maryland owes her existence to this crop. And it's particular because tobacco provides them with very little. You can't eat it. You can't feed it to animals. You can't use it to build. You can't get firewood or timber from it. You have to shelter it. You have to guard it it's a year-long process at every stage. It's a very sensitive plant, very sensitive to diseases. You have to constantly weed it and pick the worms off of it. It's susceptible to nature. It can't be allowed to blossom. It can't be exposed to wind. A lot of problems with the quality of the crop usually come from when you cut it too high to the ground or too low or too early. A very daunting process, and here it is at the forefront of Maryland's founding. It's a year-long process, and even longer once the planter is able to learn what kind of exchange they were able to receive, and probably price less than what they expected. It's more of a staple crop here in this region than anywhere else in the world. All processes of Maryland's government, society, and domestic life begin and end with the crop of tobacco. After the next session, the year after the passing of that law, here we have a handling law, which was found in March of 1639. And this was an act to prevent the hogsheads or shipping containers to be filled with things other than the purest and finest leaf that they could possibly do, because what was happening is that the hogsheads were being filled with other things besides the leaf of the tobacco, and then once that's opened up in the markets in England, obviously the merchants and the buyers are not going to be too happy. So this was an act in order to prevent some of that fluctuation and to make sure that the crop from the region maintained its integrity. So here I've underlined that no tobacco shall be exported without it being viewed and sealed by a sworn viewer. So here you start to see the organization of the crop, because they knew that this, one, it was important to their livelihood, but they also knew that they could make a pretty decent buck on it. From 1615, there were 2,300 pounds shipped from what's known as the Tobacco Coast. By 1620, that becomes 500,000 pounds. By 1670, over 10 million pounds of tobacco were leaving the colony. So you can really see how ingrained it was to the region. Plus, that's a beautiful image. You can see how educated the handwriting is. Still looking here. As we're going through some of the General Assembly acts and the proceedings, you just see exactly how tobacco is involved. So here we have the provincial court in 1679, where they are advertising here a runaway servant, an indentured servant, which is an Irish indentured servant, and the bounty hunter, as you can see here, was to be rewarded in pounds of tobacco. You also see how the pounds of tobacco has an exchange rate for sterling silver or gold. That is just also to maintain the market and to make sure that you have something to compare it with. Tobacco at this point was used to pay for all duties and taxes and fines. So here you can see that the bounty hunter, this gentleman by the name of Jones, received 4,500 pounds of tobacco. But a couple of generations after Maryland is founded, you start to see a decline in 1680 of the tobacco market. And a lot of this is enforced by the various wars that England and France are going through. A lot of their mercantile efforts had to be shifted over to the war efforts, so there are just fewer ships. But then also there were a new line of duties imposed on the English market. So it actually cost more to import the tobacco into the market than it did actually buy the product. But the England market was still high for this crop, even though the planters were receiving less of a share and the prices were rising a little bit. The demand was still there. The planters on our end down here in the colony, because tobacco is such a tender plant, you could only focus on a few acres at a time. But as these planters started to be a little bit more successful, they needed these bigger plots of land in order to grow more tobacco, because as you could only focus on a few acres at a time, the nutrients in the soil would be completely exhausted after a few seasons. They actually had to rotate your crop plot and let it fallow for a number of years in order to regenerate. So as they're growing more land, need a lot of hands to focus on the plant at a time. So here you start to see that they are needing more laborers to cultivate this plant. Let's go through a little bit in the process of what it actually takes to cultivate tobacco. This is a beautiful woodcut from 1800. A planter and merchant on Virginia's Western Shore published a book in 1800, and this was his woodcut on the tobacco process. The image is a little faint, excuse me, but you can go from top to bottom. Here you have the common tobacco house, where once the leaves are thick, the plants are cut pretty close to the earth and they're dried and the sun, and then hung on tiers inside the tobacco house from about 3 feet off the ground all the way up to the roof. You also then have the scaffolding, which is figure B, and there you can actually see the layering and the hanging of the leaves outside of the house right before they're being put into the tobacco house to dry. And you also see the prizing effort. London Town has a wonderful replica of a prizer. And basically what this was, it was a process of pressing and squeezing the tobacco into the hog's head. And this was a very delicate process because you couldn't do it too fast or too hard because you would bruise the leaves or you would break the veins and liquid would be released, and that can ruin and mold your crop. So you had to pack as much into the hogshead as you could, but you had to do it pretty delicately. And then you see the second figure down on the right, that's the inside view, and you can see the tiers of the tobacco hanging inside the house. One end would be opened just to allow for the air to circulate through the leaves in order to complete the drying process. Later on in the 18th century, you see some of these public warehouses, and basically these would be holding depots for all of the in the region that would store their various products. And these were, they were recorded in a ledger where you would have things like a crop book or a transfer book where the merchant would then, or the planter would come and exchange their hogshead of tobacco with a bill of exchange, and then they would be able to use that in order to pay for various goods or services. And then finally, you can see in the bottom figure, you can see an inspection taking place. There's an inspection law passed in Maryland in 1747 just to further avoid some of this trash or dirt tobacco to be packed in the hogshead. In 1747, the General Assembly actually passed an inspection act where 2 elected officials would serve in the warehouse and actually inspect the various hogsheads for quality. And with the hogshead, the rate to ship was not based on the weight; it was based on the cubic volume of what you could store into the hogshead. So it's like with the prizing process, that's why as much can be put into the hogshead as possible, but you had to have some limits in order to maintain the integrity of the crop. On average, you've seen various figures, but you have about 4 hogsheads of close to 1,000 pounds each that equal about a ton per shipment. And these are some close-ups of some of those images. And one of the hats that I wear in our research department is as I will go out as education outreach coordinator and go into some of the schools or colleges and give lectures similar to this, but then also to manipulate it to the audience. And what I'll do is I'll use a lot of images like this, and I'll ask a question to the students and even adults. You know, that as we're looking at images like this, you know, who's doing the work? You know, these individuals are depicted as having dark skin. You can assume here they would be African laborers, if not slaves. And then you have an image down here. Again, it's faint, I apologize, but you can see the colors of the people that are actually doing the inspecting. So you can really see some of those class distinctions becoming quite apparent. Like I said, this workup was made in 1800. So you see who's actually doing the laboring of the tobacco processing, and then you see who's doing the inspecting. Well, let's look at who's here. We tend to have a notion that black skin or being of African descent equals servitude, but that wasn't so much the case here in the 17th century. Almost all the laborers are indentured servants from England and other European countries. You have some convict laborers that were sentenced to come over and to serve the colony. But a lot of these are individuals looking to better their lives. You know, a lot of push factors. There are some pull factors. You know, there's a little, you know, there's definitely a sense of adventure into, you know, pulling up your roots and going across an ocean. But these are individuals that felt that that was a choice they had to make, and then they would sign contracts to individuals willing to pay for their voyage. And they would have contracts where they would serve under there for about 7 years. And then after that term, they would then become freeholders themselves and be free to further their estate however luck or their wills could take them. The Calverts, who owned the colony of Maryland, they introduced something called the headright system. And this was around for a couple of generations, and basically this was a tactic used to entice individuals to come over and settle into Maryland. They would pay for a voyage of themselves or for an individual, and they would receive land in exchange for bringing the settler over. a lot of times you find that these exchanges would be about 50 acres per person transferred. And this was a pretty effective tactic for the Calverts because there's nobody here. There's seemingly a vast country to the west, so they had a lot of land to fill. And the Calverts, this was their colony to do pretty much as they saw fit, as long as it maintained, the loyalties with the crown. This was a way for them to get paid because they needed settlers to come over to Maryland in order to tax them, and that's how they would get paid. So the head rate system was a way to bring people over to the colony. So here you exercise the rights to the head that you were bringing over. That's kind of where the name comes from. You would provide the name of yourself or the individuals that you're paying the transfer for. And we have a lot of the records of a lot of these transactions. But having the right to the land is different than owning the land. There was a whole other process if you wanted to become an owner and receive what's called a patent for that land. You had to have the land surveyed to make sure that the acreage was correct. And then with that surveyor certificate, you could then go through the process of receiving a patent and paying for that land. And that process is still around today, the owning the land part, not that. And a lot of these steps to own the land cost money, but a lot of these settlers are stretched pretty thin and they need to worry about paying for tools or shelter or food before having the luxury of being a landowner. Because of a lot of these names, we know of about 80% of the settlers that come into Maryland prior to the 1680s. A lot of these are here in Anne Arundel County, southern Maryland, up into Baltimore County, and then on the eastern shore, Kent County, and then down to the southern lower eastern shore. We don't know of a lot of women that received head rights. Now, to take some of these head right records, we could go into the patent records to see if a woman actually applied to patent a process of land, but I haven't done that research, so we don't know. But just in my brief, introduction and exposure to some of these records, there are very few women's names found as receiving a head right. And this worked until about 1680, when the Third Lord Baltimore actually created the land office to go through that land ownership exchange, and there it's a more reliable way to mark populations, and later it becomes used to collect the proper taxes, but then also it's a voting qualification to be a land owner. So this was a pretty effective system for about 50 years. The problem with this system and with the nature of the tobacco harvest is that you have a lot of these isolated settlements as individuals are going to plots close to rivers and streams, which have most nutrients in the soil and more desirable land to actually plant the crop, but they're all over the place. So when the people are here working, you're not going to see a lot of these stratifications because everybody has to get their hands dirty at this point. I mean, nobody is going to be able to afford to not work in the soil. So here you had indentured servants with the person who paid for their head right and an enslaved African all working on the same plot of land. And that's just the nature of what the colony was at that point. Not to say that there weren't any racist tendencies or prejudices against one another, but I mean, once the day started, you had to work together. So here we're looking at Maryland and the fact that it's unique to the Western Hemisphere because all of the new world, the production of all the new world commodities, whether we're looking at coffee or rice or tobacco or sugar or cotton or it all relied on this slave labor force. And that was just to satisfy the European cravings that the market was demanding. So it got to the point where the trade in these laborers propelled the supply used to raise the crop to the point where the European demand for these crops outweighed the cost that it took to purchase that labor. So even though, you have a lot of indentured servants, but you're starting to see a shift where some of these larger planters are starting to see the value in owning a slave for life. After one of the many English civil wars, Parliament passed what was known as the Navigation Act in 1660. And this was a policy of colonial mercantilism where all of the goods coming from England's colonies had to be shipped to England on English ships before it could be sold to market. And that was just another way to completely control economically their colonies without losing any money on the side. So here we go. We start to see the legislation in the General Assembly dealing with the aspect of enslavement. So at this point, we're about a generation in, population shifts are happening, and they are starting to talk about this down in St. Mary's City, and basically this equality that you started to see in the first half of the 17th century is beginning to dissolve. So here it is, 1663, 64. Here you have an act concerning Negroes and other slaves, and this is just the introduction on the next page over. It gives a big statute. But basically it says that all Africans to be imported into the colony, and those Africans, those of African descent that are already here in the colony, shall serve durante vita in enslavement, basically for your whole life. And they also go into some aspects of miscegenation where another example of that, a free white woman who were to marry a black slave will then also become a slave. There's an interesting component into this law because it kind of goes against not only Virginia, what they did, but here you have slaves as their fathers were. Now, this is interesting because English common law has a patrilineal lineage where a lot of the families are traced through the father's line, and they employed that with their slaves as well. One, just enforcing English common law as they knew it because they never really dealt with the institution of slavery before. The Spanish and the Portuguese have been well-versed in enslaving Africans for over 100 years at this point, but the English are relatively new into this game. So they were falling back on some of the precedents that they knew of, but also the fact that a lot of these planters weren't looking for African women to work in their fields. So the population that existed here is that most of the African population were males. So they just didn't really have the concern to be talking about the African women at this point, and that's kind of unique. You see language in an act like this where if a free-born woman should be forgetful of her free condition and to the disgrace of our nation intermarrying with a Negro slave. You start to see language like this throughout the 17th, 18th century, and basically this is inflammatory language as they're trying to deter individuals from mixing the Europeans with the African slaves. As I said, that this was a patrilineal lineage here. What they did with slaves was interesting because they didn't consider Africans to be citizens. So legislators in the British North American colonies invoke an old Roman civil law, which roughly translates into that which is brought forth follows the womb. So this is applied to the slaves that were in ancient Rome, and now British North American colonies are starting to invoke a similar law, because what Virginia did is they passed a similar law a couple of years before Maryland, but their wording invokes this Roman civil law where they feel that the lineage follows the mother. Maryland doesn't have such language in the laws passed, but it starts to become a practice used as the mixings of the races, increases and the population increases, and they just have to deal with this whole other population that they didn't really account for. So it's just a really interesting component to Maryland's dealing with this institution. So basically, in order to be a slave in Maryland, you have to be black and you have to live innocent. In this law, you also have an absence of the status of any children born to a black woman from a white man. But again, that's because the population of the black women, there just weren't a lot here in the colony, but that double standard still does exist. And it's also interesting to note that this law comes in 1660s, where enslaving Africans has been around for about a generation or two, but the rising number of Africans in the region was starting to alarm some of these landholders and the policymakers. So it goes from a population of about 1 in 30 to about 1 in 10 by the time this law is passed. So you start to have an influx of enslaved Africans. You also start to see natural increase, and it's just some of the things that the lawmakers are having to deal with at this time. You also had the Navigation Act that I mentioned in the 1660s, where all of the commodities coming from the colony had to go to mainland England. And you also see the creation of the Royal African Company in 1660, where here you start to see that English are being directly involved in that African slave trade in order to fill the needs of the planters in their colonies. It was just necessary for the planters to maintain their control over their product, and they needed cheap labor. And I like these high quality scans of some of these original images. And what I do is I always go to the edges, and you can just kind of see the condition of the paper. And this is what our in-house conservation staff has to deal with all the time, because they have to identify the problem of deterioration, stop it, and then preserve it to maintain its integrity. But yeah, I like how I got so close to it. So throughout the 17th century, it's just one law compiled after another as we're dealing with new components of slavery. Excuse me. 1681, start to see other laws. They're still invoking that durante vita. It's still of a paternal descent. And they also are, with that paternal descent, you actually see the language where it's the children born to free black women or mulattoes are free, because the mother is free, invoking that old urban common law. But then they also have this interesting component where it's they're finding any owners or mistresses or priests who were facilitating interracial marriages. And this was another deterrent from preventing the races from mixing. And they also wanted to hit it where it hurt to those people that might be facilitating some of these marriages. What was happening is that landowners and slave owners were actually getting around the laws that were starting to be formed. And what they were doing is they were forcing some of their freeborn female indentured servants to marry their slaves. Therefore, as it's a paternal descent, any children born of that woman would become a slave because their father is a slave. And actually what would happen is that the law is written where it actually, if a suit was brought where an individual is exposing some of these acts, the law would actually change the status of that mixed race child if it was found that the master had forced that union. However, there is no mention if there was a voluntary union in the 1681 law, so they're assuming, okay, you're aware of some of the laws we have in the books, your child will be a slave as we have written. However, there's another interesting component of the 1681, and now it could be a quite personal connection to the Calvert family that was ruling at that time. Jean Russo is in the back there. She'll be giving a lovely talk on the Butler family. She'll be talking tomorrow at the Maryland State Archives at noon, and what she's going to look at is a figure named Aeneas Butler. In 1681, there's a servant, Eleanor Butler, or also known as Irish Nell, and she was a well-liked servant, but she married a slave and had children. So the Calverts could have imposed this 1681 law on a personal note, But it wasn't very effective because we still see statutes and court cases further into the 18th century where the family is still actually trying to confirm that Mel is an enslaved, and their children were enslaved because of citing this old law, but it didn't quite hold. So with this, the development of the institution, it happened one instance, one law at a time. A lot of these laws you find in the General Assembly have similar language with just an amendment or two added at the end, because chances are if it's written in the General Assembly as an act or a law, it's because it's happening in the population. So as new occurrences are coming to light, the gentlemen are meeting and trying to discuss ways to rectify this growing concern, this growing population. Here in 1692, we further some of these laws in relation to slaves, but this one contains much more specifics on miscegenation, on the mixing of the races, where white servants would get additional years on top of their indenture, as well as serving time that they lost during pregnancy, and they would have to serve, rather than the master, they would have to serve the parish in that respect, because if an owner was trying to get around the law or statute or something, or trying to increase their labor force, they didn't want them also benefiting from the added years. So these laws and punishments would be imposed where the individual would have to serve the parish good rather than the master's good. Things like children of mixed races would be, marriages would serve until they're 21. And this time you actually see languages where all these rules are applied when a white man and a black woman are getting together. So here you see by the end, towards the end of the century, there's this heightened sense of racial identity. And they also saw that previous deterrents and laws were not being very effective. So you constantly see them coming together every couple of years to talk about this situation. By looking at a lot of these acts in the General Assembly, you start to see a power shift from the Calverts and those royally connected families to the planter-controlled population. And they need the slaves. They're finding problems with maintaining this population. So you start to see these lawmakers who are these landowners, slave owners, excuse me, and they are trying to keep that labor force at bay while also maintaining their interests. So here, by the time we get to 1700, you see the foundation is laid not only for establishing black chattel slavery, but also imposing social control on this population as well. 1689, you start to see the royally connected families are completely overthrown, and the planters begin to take control of the colony, or the General Assembly of the colony. So you have an even more apparent agricultural economy dominance in some of the passages and laws, and they're carving their own place in running this colony. So that's where we are come 1700. And I like to use this image because here we have Cecil Calvert, and that is he is the second Lord Baltimore, and Charles II issued the Charter to Maryland, and he's the one that actually kind of organized the colony. This is a 1670 image, and I like to show this, and unfortunately the figure I'm interested in is a little diluted. So here you have Calvert with his grandson, but then in the corner here, you have an African servant. And what I like to note about this picture is that it's in 1670, but if you look at what is being imposed into this painting and how it is, it's very important and very telling, because all this is premeditated. Here you have a show of Cecil Calvert's kind of strength and integrity. It's a legacy piece, so he has his future generations. He has a map of the colony of Maryland in his hand, but then he also chose to include the African servants. Could be a power play, a status symbol, so to speak. But then you also, if you can go in, can't do it this one, but if you go in and you look at the dress that the servant is in, he is dressed just as finely as his grandson. And this is quite telling, because here we're a generation into the colony being founded. We're understanding that, you know, tobacco is the dominant crop. You need an enslaved labor force in order to really be successful. But that's also a very expensive piece of property to own, and then to dress it in a way of an equal stature to yourself and to your grandson. I think that it's a very, very interesting image, and one that you're not going to see very often after this point. So you start to see the demographic changes of the colony. Up until 1680, you still have a servant population that's outweighing a slave population about 3 to 1. But they're starting to learn that you can get more bang for your buck by, that is 1680. You still have a servant population that's outweighing the slave population, and this is caused because, one, slaves were quite expensive, and there was very little money to be thrown around like that. But you also have the merchants who are conducting the trade, and they can get much more for a slave down in the Caribbean and in some of the lower colonies than they can in Maryland. But you do have a slave trade is beginning to increase in this area, and it lasts up until about the 1770s. It's very small in comparison to the global slave trade. I mean, it's like less than 1% of the total population. Obviously, the numbers are a little, they're not exact, but you have less than 1% of that trade coming into this region. But as you see, it is having a profound impact on what this colony is becoming. Excuse me. So as the planters are controlling the General Assembly, they're looking out for their interests. They need land and they need servants. You also at this time start to see conditions improve a little bit in Europe, where there aren't as many push factors as there were, say, a couple generations before. You start to have the Industrial Revolution is starting to kick off, where you start to see the cities are booming, factories are being formed, more jobs are available, sanitary conditions are improving. So it's a lot harder to entice people to travel over across an ocean into a wilderness. As well, immigrants are also finding a little bit more attractive possibilities in some of the more established colonies rather than coming to the Chesapeake. But here in the Chesapeake, conditions are improving a little bit. You start to see some of these larger estates, and some of these larger planters are starting to consider and find the value in purchasing a slave for life versus having an indentured servant for just a period of time. You have an increased slave trade, which is lasting into the 1770s, but you also have a huge natural increase where this population becomes self-perpetuating. By the 1700s, the Chesapeake colonies have about a 75% African slave labor force. Lots of families are being born. I mean, their roots are strong into this area as some of the planters, and even more so. But you have that natural increase that is really propelling this population. You start to see some tobacco depressions because of various duties or wars or storms or natural elements that may have affected the crop. So you're starting to see fewer servants on inventories of tobacco planters once they have passed. But at the same time, you're seeing more and more slaves showing up on these inventories. So this demonstrates that those that were investing in the slave trade were still making money because the slaves are showing up in the colony and people have bought them. But the people that are purchasing the slaves are not making very much money on their crop. So you can still see that, you know, if you're a merchant in slaves, regardless of whether the planter is making money, you have a product that they need, so they're going to go ahead and split the bill for it. So the slave trade in the Chesapeake lasts about 100 years. period. So you have the middle of the 1600s over to about 1770. And this element was something that all the white settlers could kind of unify. The African, they were different. Regardless of your status, whether you're an indentured servant was talking to a great landowner, that was a bond that the two of them could come together with and share in order to further stratify the population down and create kind of this social hierarchy. Then we come to this Act of 1715, and basically this is a 10-page, 36-article passed by the General Assembly relating to all things dealing with this population. They start to restrict where they can go in the colony, how they need to have permissions or passes, should they intend to travel more than a certain number of miles from their home. You were also starting to see a lot of language for individuals that may have been assisting in some of these enslaved Africans as they were attempting to flee their condition. They're actively resisting the fact that they were found to be enslaved for life. So you start to see a lot more people simply running away and trying to better the situation. So you start to see some language that is really putting deterrents on those individuals that would help or would, if you gave them a loaf of bread, if you told them where the next house was, or if you actually went with them to travel, the huge fines were imposed. So you also see things in this act where should an indentured servant complete their indenture, that they were to be given tools and things that they would need in order to live their life, as a free planter. So they have freedom dues that were laid out to give the servants, some tools, change of clothes, some corn, and such. You also started to see penalties on owners for not providing popular provisions or popular services to their slave population. Again, slaves were going to be slaves for life. You also see an interesting element here where individuals on their plantations were sharing the scripture with their enslaved population, and some were even going as far as baptizing some of their slaves. The problem with that is that Christians can't enslave Christians, but in order to get around, a little law like that, they just felt that, because Africans weren't citizens, that you can give them the sacrament, but it's not going to change their condition. So you can still go ahead and read the Bible to your slaves, you can baptize them, and still know that they will still be slaves after that day. Various corporal punishments, whippings and beatings for stealing and stuff like that. Slaves can't own guns, and the such and the such. So here, 1715, they have about 80 years under their belt, and they finally came down and sat down, and they realized all of these issues that came about from this population, and they tried to encompass it in the Act of 1715. Here's an image I like to show of the goal, I guess it was, as some of these landowners were becoming slave owners, and this was kind of where they envisioned that you have the owner, the landowner, and this is much different than the images that we've seen before, because here you have the difference in dress. He's, on the rocking chair, reading a newspaper, enjoying his afternoon. Meanwhile, he has his enslaved population doing the labor and harvesting for him. That this was the goal. You start to see some of these class distinctions being developed as this gentry or landowning population becomes a little bit more established. Like I said, you have the owner watching over the worker. And you also look at some of the furniture or the architecture of the house and some of their clothing. Basically, in order to maintain this image, they had to have all of the goods that went with this image. They had to have some of those finest European goods, the latest fashion. these are individuals that are portraying an image to be worthy of the upper class in Europe at that time. A lot of the settlers here in the colony of Maryland are second sons, working class people, because in England at the time they were practicing primogeniture, where basically the estate would go to the firstborn, and all the other children, had to, find their other means. So that was a big push factor for some of these larger, more established families in Europe, and you have their adventurer younger son going out trying to make a name for themselves and to reach a status that they probably wouldn't have reached that should they stay over in Europe. It's constantly this image and this one-upmanship mentality of the planters here in the Chesapeake. On inventories, you see a lot of European periodicals and magazines being found on some of these inventories, so that some of these larger planters could just, kind of stay abreast of some of the latest trends. They're also starting to learn the crop of tobacco a little bit more. It's becoming more of a science. They're learning different techniques, and they are finding that they're trying to find ways to put themselves in a position where they're not as vulnerable to some of the booms and busts of the tobacco market. You also have larger planters like this who begin to diversify their crops, where they're not just growing tobacco, but some have orchards and some build mills, and others are growing different crops, just so they're not so reliant on this one crop. The quality of a man's tobacco in their crop was also a sign of the worth of that individual. If their quality of their tobacco was any question, that was a huge blow to their ego. It was a very personal connection to their crop and to their craft. And as merchants would come up and down the Chesapeake, and if they would learn of an exchange that their neighbor got that was more favorable than an exchange that they got, they weren't necessarily mad at the merchant, they were upset at themselves because they figured, well, my crop must not have been as good as John does down the street. So what did I do wrong? I probably cut it, a little too early, or I might have let it dry too long, or I shouldn't have packed that much into the prizer. So they started really thinking, in their heads what they did wrong, and then they're going to rectify it in the next season. But it was a very, you see kind of like trademarks and signs on some of these hog heads, because it was a very, very personal connection to their product, because they wanted to maintain the integrity if they were to have a good crop. In order for the planters to maintain this image, they have to deal with extensions of credit, and with the credit, basically a lot of debt. And with the Maryland planters, the debt is on a large scale to English merchants, and you start to get to a point where not just some of the smaller planters are in debt, but even the large estate owners are deeply in debt to some of these English merchants. But everybody, the merchants, the planters, a lot of people are overextended because of such a large credit being given to planters in the colonies. So a lot of times when a merchant comes in and calls in for their debt, a lot of times what happens is that the slave owner will go ahead and liquidate some of the slaves and sell them off in order to maintain, or in order to pay off the debt. So here you have the disruption of a lot of slave families in the region, and they could be sold to God knows who, go God knows where, and that family unit would be completely disrupted. At this point, so you have the separation of the races, separation of classes. You also start to see a unique African-American culture kind of developing on their own, as they're physically separated more so from the planters. Meanwhile, 50, 100 years ago, they would have been sleeping in the same house. Here you have them on slave quarters, or portions of the estate where they would sleep away from the family. More slave families are becoming self-perpetuating, so you're starting to see a lot of slave families on these plantations, where, like I said, 50, 100 years ago, it was just young African males that were dominating this population. Here you're seeing, a lot of women, a lot of children, multi-generational families living and working on these estates. And because of that, the labor force in the unit, that is becoming more stable in itself for the planters to really utilize. And that's where you really start to see this massive slave holding really propel as we get into the 18th century. So as the slave owners and landowners are trying to maintain their image, they're starting to realize just how dependent they are on the mother country and the merchants at this time. And also knowing that a lot of their neighbors are in the same boat too. So it's really that's why I say this fought autonomy, because, as much as they are trying to maintain that image, in reality, someone's going to come knocking on the door and where are they going to be at the end of that? London Town was integral throughout this whole process of everything that I just tried to lay out to you. London Town was pretty much in the forefront of a lot of this. It's a colonial town established in 1683 by an act that was used for the advancement of trade, where the General Assembly was beginning to form towns and various ports for trading. There were 3 ports established here in Anne Arundel County, one being right here on Colonel William Burgess's land on South River. There was about 100 acres laid out, and it was very active, very booming, very important port here in Anne Arundel County, that it was actually considered to be, it was the Anne Arundel County seat until 1694. It's a big trade center. A lot of the planters from the area would bring their hogsheads down to the wharf, and that's where the merchant ships would come and do their exchanges. The Chesapeake is blessed with a number of navigable rivers where some of these ships can come pretty far inland, and that just gives London Town that direct exchange with a global economy. Excuse me. You see a lot of advertisements in newspapers about various ships coming in, selling their goods, and they're from all over the world. East Indies, Africa, Europe, South America, they're from all over the place, and they're able to come directly into these people's backyards. Reached its height up in the 1720s, and then actually at that point it was up for consideration to be the capital for the state of Maryland, but actually lost to people over there. So. As I said, London Town is integral in this entire process, including enslaving Africans. We had an intern that was working at the archives back in 2012, I think, and she really dove into this project where there was an original compilation of slaves listed for individuals living in London Town, and it had a little bit more than 300 on that list. As we go through some of the more records where we knew information was found, she ended up finding 600 more slaves that were associated with individuals that owned plots here in London Town. Now, were the slaves in London Town too? In London Town proper, we don't know, because a lot of these individuals also owned plots outside of the area. So, but they were associated with an individual located here in London. So this intern went through a lot of our records, wills and inventories, tax lists, land records and such, and that's where she came up with that other 600, giving us a total of about 960 slaves. Probably more out there, but just as far as her research was able to take her. That's the number that we were applied. So here we also have a couple of free blacks living in the area, and free black families were certainly not unheard of in Maryland, but they were rare. You have a lot of individuals that come over as indentured servants of African descent. They come in, they serve their indenture, and then they live as free persons. Some of the families were actually able to be quite successful. You have the Driggs down in southern Maryland, where you have a group of women in this family that are actually petitioning the Somerset County court to stop being taxed as if they're slaves, because they're claiming that they're free born. You have the Johnson family, a huge African American family coming up from Virginia. He comes in 1620, goes over to the Eastern Shore, and then he's actually found on a headright for an individual claiming about 3,000 acres in Somerset County the year that Somerset County was able to be settled. It was like 1666, I think it was. So here they were at the forefront of founding the colony. They were able to survive and work, and with a little luck and some hard work, they were able to establish themselves as prominent members of society. Anthony Johnson, there's an interesting story where he is on the Eastern Shore of Virginia in the 1630s, I think, and he's a tobacco farmer, and his tobacco house goes up in flames. A part of the curing process, as they were hanging the dried leaves, is that they would actually smoke the tobacco. Well, I guess the flame got a little too big, and the firehouse completely goes up in flames. You can imagine how detrimental that would be to an individual whose entire life is found in that house. Well, he petitions to the county court in order to relieve himself of paying taxes that year, because I guess the timing was around when the taxes would be due. So he goes around, and there are depositions from community members saying that he's been a part of us for 20 odd years, and he's a good, honest individual, and the county court actually allows him to not pay his taxes that year. So you can see that it's not completely unheard of, because these families are a part of the foundation as a lot of these white families, but as the years goes on, you can really see where that possibility, the window of opportunity is becoming much more narrow. We also have a number of runaway slaves located here in London town, and then we have 2 levy-free slaves, and these are basically slaves that are noted and recorded, but the owner wouldn't have to pay a levy tax on them for any number of reasons. They could be old or crippled in a way, but those are some of the numbers that we find here. There were a couple of slave ships that actually come into this region. 1760 ship, the Jenny's, coming from Liverpool with slaves from Angola. Actually has to fight off a French ship, an attack off Barbados. And actually you have word that the captain actually armed some of the slaves in order to help with the fight. So it docked right off here at the South River in July of 1760, and there was an ad in the Maryland Gazette noting that he was here to sell goods and that a lot of slaves from Angola were on the ship. Let's look at some of the individuals. And this image here is just a little blip of all the slaves that we have noted for Richard Hill. Richard Hill was a number of things. He was a major landowner here in London town. He was born in Annapolis, 1698. He comes from a Quaker family, but he was a slave owner. So here, the connection between being a Quaker and being an abolitionist wasn't nearly as ingrained as you see in the 19th century. But he was a Quaker, and he owned slaves. He was a physician, he was a botanist, and he was also a merchant. So he saw every aspect of the industry all the way around, including owning up to 39 slaves. Being a merchant, so he was dealing with the trade of the tobacco. He was a slave owner, so he's had to maintain his labor force. And he was also a victim of trying to uphold this gentleman planter image, where so much so, we're actually in 1737, he has a note where he's trying to seek immunity from his debts for that year, but he is denied. He actually has to liquidate almost all of his holdings, slaves, land, 4 of his ships, all but 2 of his slaves, 3 London town plots. He sells them all to another London town merchant, John Galloway, and it's pretty much the last straw. I mean, what else can you do at that point? When the debts are called in, you have to pay. So he had to liquidate his whole estate. So he leaves the colony defeated, but he still continues to work as a merchant, going back and forth between the Mid-Atlantic and England. He is from a pretty prominent family here in London town, and these families were making connections with other big families in the area in order to kind of keep that class structure organized, where he actually marries Pennsylvania Governor Thomas Lloyd. He marries his granddaughter, and spends lots of time up in Philadelphia, ships off of London and Madeira, where he actually dies in Philadelphia in 1762. But just to further his ties with the tobacco crop is that in 1751, his only son, Henry, actually dies in an accident where he falls from a rafter in a tobacco house, hanging the tobacco. So just to see, life starts and ends around this plant, and Richard Hill is one of the guys that really saw all those angles. Go back to the General Assembly as we're starting to see more of these acts being passed. So here we have 1729. And here you start to see some language that's quite unique, and I'm not going to read both, but here you have the Act of 1729, Section 2, where you have cruel and horrid murders have been lately committed by Negroes, which cruelties they were instigated to commit and hereafter may be instigated to commit with the like inhumanity, because they have no sense of shame. The laws of England is not sufficient to deter people from committing the greatest cruelties. Again, they have no English common law to set a precedent on how to actually punish some of these acts. So they're making it up as they go. When any Negro or other slave was convicted of any petty treason or murder or willfully burning of dwelling houses, that Negro or slave was to have the right hand cut off, to be hanged in the usual manner, the head severed from the body, divided into 4 quarters, and head and quarters sent to the most public places of the county where such act was committed. So that's what they felt that they had to do in order to start to stop seeing some of these acts committed. Further, like I said, for the 17th and 18th century, as we're looking in our government records about this population, we don't have many voices or names of this population. So we have to kind of rely on laws like this and some of the various court cases or proceedings that come about for them in order to really know more about this population. Obviously, to be an enslaved person in 17th and 18th century Chesapeake is not pleasant. A lot of people were unhappy, and a lot of people chose to run away as an option of trying to better their situation. And you start to see these in increasingly large numbers. Great newspapers, the Maryland Gazette, which covered a lot of these issues for this time. And it's a major source for runaway advertisements, and you start to see that this was much more common, but then you also start to see language in the runaway advertisements noting maybe reasons for flight, which of course is completely, I couldn't know why my slave Johnny would run away. I'll show you a contradictory statement in a minute. So here you have the Act of Assembly, 1737, where they start talking about accomplices to those that assist in the flight. And the punishments are almost just as bad as being the person that actually ran away. So here you have person stealing any Negro or other slave, or who shall counsel, hire, aid, or abet, or command any person to commit the same, or who shall be accessory to the said offense, on conviction, outlawry, standing mute, or peremptory challenge above, so shall suffer death without benefit or clergy. And this is 1737, so this is 100 years after we start to see some of the statutes passed in the state, but that's a pretty big deterrent on anybody. And that could be from the slightest, giving them a pair of shoes to physically helping them run away to the next stop, providing any food. Any of these could be considered offenses of this. Again, continue just kind of layering some of the acts. Here we have 1751. And here you see that you will have years added to indentures. Excuse me. So if anything, if you knew of a slave that ran away and you didn't turn him in, if you knew a friend or a coworker that helped the slave turn him in, there was a huge payment that if you were found guilty, a huge payment you had to pay. And then times it would be to pay for the value of that slave to the person. So here you have the class and racial hierarchy, even with equaling economic levels and cementing the laws and punishments that would go into this institution. Looking at those laws passed, we have to talk about Joseph Galloway. Joseph Galloway, again a Quaker, again a slave owner, living here in London town, a merchant. He had 19 slaves on his inventory, a well-liked man, and here we have his obituary found in the Maryland Gazette, 1752, where it notes that he was justly esteemed by all his acquaintances, and he was a very fair dealer and an honest man. In 1750, two of Joseph Galloway's slaves, Negro Jane and Negro Grace, as they're described in the court case, were charged with burning down his tobacco barn. Major way of resistance on the part of these two women. Fighting the institution, fighting the owner, fighting the economy. They do a pretty dire act in that respect, where they burn down his tobacco barn. And here they say that the tobacco barn wasn't empty. It had tobacco, fodder, corn, and other grain that were to be used on his populations. Excuse me, on his estate. But it's a major, major form of resistance. Excuse me. So the jurors of Anne Arundel County sentenced this Negro Jane and Negro Grace to be death by hanging after hearing the various depositions. So here they came in at night, between the hours of 9 and 10. They put billets of wood against the tobacco house and just set the flame. But this is a unique perspective when you look between the lines, and the fact that here you have Negro Jane, and Negro Grace, seemingly, just laboring slaves. They're meant to be kept ignorant and out of the loop and uninformed, so they don't think crazy thoughts about trying to be free or anything like that. But here, they knew what this act was. They knew what they were doing with this act. They knew exactly the intention that they had. They knew how detrimental that would be to their owner at the time. So this was a huge, huge psychological act as well on the part of the slaves in order to show how much they did understand about what was going on in Maryland. They took the risk and they paid the ultimate price for it. And this is a judgment record from the March Court in 1750 here in Arundel County. And again, you can see how beautiful they handled this. When I go into classrooms, a lot of times I'll leave up a big document like this, or just a couple of lines, and I'll leave it up on the screen, and I won't have any transcription next to it, and I'll kind of make the kids squirm a little bit. Because the kids don't know cursive. They do not know how to read cursive. This is a foreign language in 10 years. So we need researchers. And then here, more documents about chasing Jane. So here you have hanged by the neck until they be dead. And it doesn't really give much else besides the fact that they were worth about 50 pounds current money each. And then here you have the ad in the Maryland Gazette for their public execution. They're noted as, they don't even name them, the two young Negro wenches. This was a year after the actual act. So the Maryland Gazette is a fantastic resource. A couple more examples of individuals here in London town as they're dealing with the institution. Here we have Richard Moore and his slave Sam. He was a merchant, a landowner, a slave owner. He had 18 slaves on his inventory. His inventory is almost 1,000 pounds sterling. But we have this runaway advertisement, which was found in the Maryland Gazette, from one of his slaves, Sam, in 1756. And I used this, this ad just because of, one, how descriptive they are in these runaway ads. You can imagine, time before cameras, they had to be quite descriptive on who they were looking to find. They'll note physical appearance, they'll note known relations, if they have family members in Baltimore, or if they know a merchant in St. Mary City, any kind of clothes that they may have on or have taken during their flight. But I used this image because, so Sam, with remarkably good and white teeth, is a notorious villain, as his back will testify. So they're noting any scars or oddities or, disformities that they may have, but, obviously you can take that how you think. And here we have a value of 10 shillings, and this is in 1756. We don't know how old he is. I don't think it says how old he is, but there is a Sam found on Richard Moore's inventory, and he's listed at 25, and this was 4 years after this, so it could have very well been the same Sam that we're looking at here, which means he did not meet it. We also have Anne Lambert here, a Quaker woman, lived near the head of the South River. It is noted that, excuse me, she would host a number of Quaker meetings in the area. She was childless, we believe, because in her will of 1703, she is bequeathing her estate to the Friends meeting houses here in the county and then also in London. But then she also delays the manumission of her slaves. She has, I don't know the number, 4 or 5 slaves, I believe, and they are all manumitted here. So here we have that my Negro man, Mingo, and Negro woman Bess shall be free. And then she also had, shall be free after the crop is harvested. I think it's not right now, you still gotta go. And then also, excuse me, Negro girl Nan, and she is to be manumitted in 1711. So one, we think that she's childless because she is giving her slaves the manumission and not bequeathing them to her heirs, which is what would happen a lot of time. But then also the fact that she's giving her entire estate to the Quaker churches also kind of signals that she doesn't really have much of a family after her. But you start to see some of these wills contain these manumissions more so in the 18th century. And they are, a lot of them are designed to be, for the slaves to be manumitted at a later date, because they do know that, how valuable this population is to the success of the family or the estate, so they don't want to leave their children completely without that labor force the second that their owner may pass. So they'll say, like you said, after the crop is harvested, or, Nan is to be manumitted in 1711, so she might be a teenager at this point, and she might be reaching 21 years of age, and later on you start to see 31 years of age more frequent. Was this a financial act? Was it an act of benevolence on, as she's laying on her deathbed? Does she want to have a clear conscience? I mean, you're not exactly sure. It's probably a little bit of both, I would think, on these ends. Especially because, some of the teachings of the Quakers, even like I said, they're not staunch abolitionists at this point. I do think that there is at least a recognition of a soul or a person behind some of their labor, so that might be a factor in this. But here you see all different spectrums of dealing with this institution, and that's what's really hard about Maryland and about this topic, is because there is no one-size-fits-all experience description of what this condition was like. There are various forms and various facets, and from plantation to plantation, even on plantation to plantation, slave to slave, on what their experiences were. You know, were there kind slave owners? I mean, yeah, sure, but I mean, I don't think that that negates from the argument that these individuals owned people, and that these people were then listed on documents along other bits of property, you know, right above the cart and before the ox. You'll see some of these slaves listed. So that's a conversation that you can go on and on and on about, but it's just real interesting because, you know, people ask me, well, talk to me about slavery, describe what it's like to be a slave in Maryland. An hour later, here I'm still trying to do it. So London town is kind of short-lived. We have the 1747 Inspection Act, like I mentioned, where it notes allocations for the county. London town wasn't one of those. We also have some routes a little bit more west. Also, as we're coming up into the Revolution, you don't see a lot of trade happening. Excuse me. So you see London town really starting to diminish as the 18th century goes on. Annapolis is growing at the same time, so a lot of merchants move their stores there. And here we're always, you know, London town has a pretty good collection of individuals that they know of on their website. We have a link on our website of individuals that we've uncovered with various biographies, and we'll tell the narrative of their story, and we'll provide some of the primary documents where we got that information. But of course, it's not inclusive, and we know of, we figure there are a lot more London town residents out there for us yet to discover. London town is really, really unique and really a special place just because you have the historical, you know, remnants of a town that was here, and then you also have a lot of the archaeological finds that were unearthed over the years as they're going through the various plots that were able to really kind of see the design of this area and the importance through both the historical record that's left and also for the physical remains found in the ground. So London town really has a lot going for it, and you're always learning new dimensions and new figures and the such. There we go. That's all I have really on that topic. Are there any questions or comments? I know I threw a lot at you, but I tried to just kind of set the scene on why it was happening here, how it was. And what we've done is we've gone into a lot of the records at the archives and really page by page just trying to unearth some of these occurrences and who these people were, and you know, trying to get a little bit better understanding of what kind of people settled here in Maryland. With our research department, legacy is we funded, so we are looking out for various projects. We just completed a almost 4-year project from a grant that we got from the Department of Education, where we looked at the movements of active flight and resistance on individuals that may have been in the involved in the Underground Railroad. So what we've done is we've looked at 5 counties on the eastern shore, and we've gone and done that county study that I mentioned before, is where we're going to the census population and create a database of those individuals that live there. And then we'll also go into the newspapers and other periodicals to see who actually ran away, or at least what owners put an ad out for an individual that run away. And we have over, like in our database on slavery.msa.maryland.gov, we have over 300,000 names of individuals that we found from, we've done about half the counties in the state over the course of 13 years. And we're always looking for grants to do the rest of those. So Southern Maryland is a big one that we haven't gone into, which is interesting because it's also one of the biggest slave owning regions in the area. But the problem on our side is that there are not a lot of records that remain for this time period that we're able to really do an inclusive study. So, you know, we always got to deal with situations like that. Yes, Chris.
The reports, the results of your research, are they written into reports that are available online?
We do have some of our grant, the research that we did for grants, we do have a final project report. And some of those are available online. But if you go to our website, which is slavery.msa, as in Maryland State Archives, .maryland.gov, we compile all of our information in the form of a case study. Basically, this is a biographical narrative of an individual that we happen to find in a record. So if we just find that one runaway advertisement of Richard Moore and Sam, that's kind of where we start. And then we'll go into the various records and see if we can kind of complete a more encompassing narrative of their life. And all of those case studies are available online. Because we're all social historians, and that's kind of our product at the end of all the research, is to kind of tell their story. And we do have some documents that deal with like sheer numbers and like a collection of the resources that we utilize. I might have used some video on that.
You mentioned a book that was written around 1800.
William Tatham's book.
Where is that available?
I think that is available online in its entirety from the Library of Virginia, I think. Let me see where I got it. It is William Tatham and the Culture of Tobacco.
Thank you.
The author's last name is Hearn. So, question, yes?
Could you repeat the website?
Yes.
Reports?
Yes, it's slavery.msa, as in Maryland State Archives, .maryland.gov. What Maryland did a couple of years ago is that all the state agencies that have Maryland.
That was like a separate slave culture in Maryland,
Mm-hmm.
but it is a complex times. Do you see that happening sooner or later in the urban areas, or is it more simultaneously?
In the urban areas, there is seemingly a little bit more of a autonomous nature, I think, just because of the capacity that they would be serving, where a lot of times they would have to go to the different people in the city to a little bit more freedom rather than work on this one forever kind of thing. As far as times, I don't really know. You start to see Baltimore really coming to age in the later part of the 18th century, so there could be a connection with that, just as, and I just use Baltimore as an example just because that's the biggest city in our state. And so you do start, I would say, yeah, there actually is a little bit of a connection, I think about it, as you start to see some of these larger estates being developed and more established, while at the same time, because a lot of these great planters, you know, Baltimore was going to be one of those main ports, so they're also taking their products down to the wharf to be traded, so a lot of them might have residencies or offices right there in the city, so it might be even one the same, but that's an interesting question. I'm trying to think of a resource that might really look into that. Not sure. I'll have to follow up. Question, Matt?
Yes. Do you have any research or is there any resource you could identify that would list the names of all the plantations in this county and surrounding areas? For example, if I give you a location, that you can tell me back in time the name of the plantation or the landowner who owns these properties.
Yes, you can do, and that would be called a title search. And basically what you would be going, if at whatever period you knew of an individual being somewhere, you could start with that land record. And in that land record, in the wording, there should be a citation for where this plot came from, you know, a piece of John's chance or what have you. And then they can give you citations where you can theoretically go back in the ledgers through time. So if you're looking at one little parcel of land, it's going to be encompassed in a much larger plot, and theoretically you can go back to that plot and eventually given from Charles II to Lord Baltimore. So when we do title searches, the archives, just to experiment, the archives in 2012, I believe, had to do a similar title search for about 20 acres up in Harford County that was completely unclaimed. throughout time, lines just missed, and there's a plot of about 20 acres in the middle of the woods that I think a Boy Scout group was utilizing it for their summer retreats or something like that. Well, they paid to have that survey done, the certificate, and then actually do a land patent search. And our researchers because the archivist is also head commissioner of land patents, so they did the title search. They found that theoretically this land was still the property of Lord Baltimore, and that they could then go ahead and, should they want to purchase the land, it would be at fair market value, that they would go ahead and do that. But yeah, just with that, the land records, I don't know if you were here in the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned we have a resource online, it's called mdlandrec.net, and that's where you would be able to do that.
Okay, one more follow-up.
Sure.
What do surnames and last names tell us? For instance, my maiden name is Downs. Could I take that and I was, at one point in time, I researched that, our research told me that a lot of free slaves were given the last names of the landholders.
Mm-hmm.
Or, is it possible that I could come to the archives and research the origins of my name and trace it back to my ancestors?
If all the pages fit and all the records are all there, available, not destroyed, theoretically, yes, you could do that. But like I mentioned earlier, it's really hard to do African American research because of that exact issue that you're talking about. Sometimes they took their owners' last names. Sometimes they loathed it, obviously, and they had their own name. And they'll take names throughout history, going back to ancient Greek and Roman times, all the way up until contemporary. Washington and Jefferson, we can use our names like this, because those are names that they know.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at the records in our holdings, especially when you go back prior to the Civil War, you have to know a little bit about the slave holding family before you can get into the information about the slave, because the records that we house are about the owner. They have information about the enslaved population, but it's not a record about the slave, it's a record about the owner.
So when the slaves first began to get last names?
You see it all throughout time, but as far as, it's really an individual occurrence on when individuals started having their circles. So it would be, depending on your family. So like with a lot of the runaway ads, some have two names, others have aliases, others just have, Negro Sam or something like that. So, yeah, question.
When you were listing the 961 slaves that were here in London town, the 7 free blacks, do you have their names and the years they were here?
We have some of those. Again, it wasn't my individual research, it was an intern's a couple of years ago, and I do believe we do have their names. Where they lived, not sure. That was a part of her process, was to figure out exactly what lot they were associated with, but I have to go back and see it.
Now, can we find that online?
Her database, I do not believe is online, but if you want to talk to afterwards, we can kind of see about how you see it. Good. Any other questions? Thanks a lot, guys. I had a lot of fun.